Hey team, welcome back and happy Halloween. I'm recording this on Halloween. This is going to be the last half, essentially, of the GI anatomy and physiology lecture for paramedics. We'll go into some depth here on the remaining portion of the GI tract, and that'll include the small intestine, a few videos on some accessory organs that help us digest food or create components that help us digest food in the small intestine. And then we'll end up finishing talking about the colon and things people put in it. Yes, that's where we're going. So right now, let's talk about how the sausage is made. So we left off previously talking about the stomach. Now we're moving again towards the rectum in our travel through the alimentary canal. We're now at the small intestine. The small intestine is pretty long. It's got a bunch of intestinal length that's crammed into the abdomen. So again, this is why it's often hard for us to narrow down patients' pain complaints to a specific organ because of the large amount of tissue that's shoved into the abdomen at any given time. Everything's compressed very close together, so it's hard to narrow things down, as we've talked about. It's not very large in diameter, though, only about 2 centimeters or a little short of about an inch or so in size. There's 3 sections of the small intestine, and we'll talk about them as we go through, because in each of these sections, a different portion and a combination of components of digestion are occurring at any given time. The small intestine also has smooth muscle lining, just like we saw in the esophagus. Smooth muscle lining was present in the stomach, and this all aids in those wave-like contractions called peristalsis that gives us our gastric motility, moving food stuff through the intestine and then eventually creating waste out of the anus. So in this view, we've got a couple of the sections of the small intestine as it might present, of course, with some portions cut off to give us this highlight of what's really just kind of shoved into the small space of the abdomen. So previously we talked about the food stuff making its way through the stomach. We have our pyloric sphincter here, and then we spill into the small intestine at the duodenum. The duodenum is the part of the small intestine that is closest to the stomach and is where really digestion is going to start with the use of enzymes. But something to think about is that the food stuff that comes out of the stomach into the duodenum still has acid mixed within it. So it has a very low pH or high acid concentration, and that could be detrimental because what we're going to find is that many of the components that help break down food are enzymes. And as you remember, enzymes are generally proteins, functional proteins. And if we have proteins in acid environments or low pH environments, they tend to denature. If proteins that are functional proteins like enzymes denature, then they lose their function. They lose their ability to do what it was that they were doing to change or facilitate some chemical process. So it's important that we realize that as that acid spills into the intestine, in order for the enzymes to be functional, we're going to need to correct that acid environment so that we can both allow for proteins to function optimally, and they function optimally at specific pH ranges, and also we have, again, beneficial bacteria in our intestines that help us break down some of the tougher foods for our body to digest, and they have a pH range that they're optimally healthy in, and we wouldn't want to lose them because that will throw off the flora of our internal digestive tract. As we go past and through the duodenum, we'll make our way to the jejunum. The jejunum is the longer portion of the small intestine and travels all the way until we get to the point where we are at the ileum. The ileum is the terminal part of the small intestine and connects to the large intestine or the colon at the point of the ascending colon, where we have our appendix attached, the cecum, and the ileum all coming together. This is a picture of the inside of the abdomen, and you can see we've got our fat stores associated with the mesentery, blood vessels throughout, and we can see the small intestine here. All right, let's talk a little bit about the small intestine's anatomy and how that anatomy kind of gives rise to our functional physiology. So the lining of the small intestine has a mucous membrane, and mucus is important because mucus is going to be mixed throughout the process of digestion to help propel this stuff forward, but also to provide an environment where the food stuff can be mixed, and we have a term for that in a little bit. There's a lot of glands throughout the intestine that are going to secrete different enzymes, and the fluid that the enzymes exist in, we generally talk about as a juice, intestinal juice. So we'll talk about pancreatic juice, which has enzymes in it that help break down food. So when we say the intestinal juice, really what you're thinking about is a mix of mucus and probably a mix of functional proteins or enzymes. All right, so what does the pancreas secrete? Well, we'll talk about the pancreas in more detail a little bit later, but the pancreas is one of the things that the pancreatic juice is going to secrete is bicarbonate. And as we mentioned, this is spilling into the duodenum where we have a very low pH environment, and the bicarb is going to help bring our pH to an optimal round. So it's going to bring that pH up more to an optimal range for the protein to function in, and that allows us to, our body to then optimally break down the food. There's also going to be other enzymes that are secreted into and from the pancreas that we'll talk about in a moment, but just an example of what's kind of happening in this mixing. The intestinal structure is really unique. Although, yes, we know that it has a very long length, right, that's packed into the small space of the abdomen. That's not actually talking about the overall surface area of the small intestine. So the small intestine has microscopic finger-shaped projections called villi, and the villi are going to give us that increased surface area so that we can have a kind of compressed pathway for absorption, but we maximize inside of it the surface area because the surface area is what's needed to allow for that absorption to occur into the bloodstream. So we can see here the intestine looking like a tube here. If we look microscopically, we see not only the folds of the intestine, right, the folds of the intestine, but we also see the villi extending on them. So each one of these creates a larger surface area for us to process and absorb the resulting nutrients that will then absorb into the body and be either used for storage or energy or rebuilding cells and so on. So the villi's role is to increase absorptive surface area. So you can imagine that if we were to take the intestine and lay it outward outside of the body, it would certainly be a great length. But if we were to unfold all of the surface area, it would be many times longer than that. Primarily the microvillus or the villi are going to work on absorbing things like sugars and amino acids in different areas of the body. They're rich with capillary beds. That means they've got a lot of blood vessels that are there for absorption to occur. And we also have some structures in here from the lymph system that function as kind of part of our immune system, not pictured here. But the lymph system is present in structures called lacteals. And they're going to be helpful in absorbing fat as well. If we look at this cross-section of the male body with the abdomen exposed, we can see just how densely packed these things are. So in our diagram, we have the liver here, and on top of the liver would generally be the diaphragm, and above that are lungs. The spine is the hard surface in the back that the abdomen is compressed against in the peritoneal space, and the abdominal wall is a little bit more pliable, doesn't have bone structure, but the muscle helps kind of keep it together. So we can see here's a cross-section of our stomach, so the esophagus would be coming down. The pancreas located across the kind of right hypochondriac to left hypochondriac, and the transverse colon. We'll talk about the colon towards the end of this. The greater omentum and the mesentery to provide some cushion, energy supply and storage, fat storage, and pathway for blood vessels to travel from larger circulation into the abdominal intestinal circulation. We have our peritoneal membrane, and remember that we have a cavity here, the peritoneal cavity. And as we've talked about in medicine before, when we have a cavity, generally there's membranes that are lining the cavity and membranes that are lining the organ. And here, so the peritoneal cavity has two of those membranes. There's going to be the visceral peritoneum. Visceral peritoneum is on the surface of the organ whenever we're using that term, so it doesn't matter where in the body it is. Visceral peritoneum is on the surface of the organ, and so that would be the surface of our intestinal structures. And our parietal peritoneum is on the inner surface of the abdominal wall. Here we can also see the urinary bladder underneath all of this, and the rectum, which will come from the colon, with our sigmoid colon bringing it into alignment with the rectum. Now, the small intestine can have a number of disorders, and we're only listing a few of those here for our purposes, because again, in a separate class, you'll take the disease process or pathophysiology and treatment of intestinal disorders. Enteritis, we've talked about gastroenteritis. Enteritis here is talking about an inflammation of the stomach and intestines. And again, the stomach and intestines are connected to the pyloric sphincter. So it makes sense that if you've got inflammation in an area near to one, the other organ will be affected as well. Malabsorption syndrome can occur, and there's a lot of different components that go into malabsorption syndrome. But this is generally a group of diseases or disorders that result from the person not able to, or causes the person not able to absorb the nutrients in the normal light. And because of that, the patient might have a variety of other issues, including anorexia, because they're not getting the nutrients in their body to build the tissue that they need, cramps, anemia if bleeding has occurred, or anemia if we're not absorbing things and using iron appropriately, for example, fatigue, and so on. Malabsorption syndromes are kind of a long list, and I'll tell you about kind of one of them. The result of a autoimmune disorder, or not really well understood, but seems to be an autoimmune disorder called Crohn's disease, which I actually unfortunately have. Crohn's disease causes inflammation in the intestine, and because of the inflammation of the lining of the intestine and the secondary effects of that, it's hard for the intestine then to process food and absorb nutrients appropriately. So in some of the worst conditions of a patient having something like a Crohn's disease flare, again, which is inflammation of the intestine, that Crohn's disease flare can result in the person not absorbing food, losing lots of weight, resulting in anorexia, and not getting the nutrients they need. So that's unfortunately something that patient's going to have to deal with, and is not necessarily curable, but may be managed by medical means.